Who's your commander?
Good luck.
Equip.
Move to combat.
Resolves.
Now, before you attack
Does
me,
anyone have an answer?
well played.
Good game.
Hi, Jumbo Commander here, and today's deck tech is on Sidisi Brood Tyrant. Sidisi Brood Tyrant is 1 black, green, blue for a 3/3 legendary Naga Shaman. This is not a snake. I know it looks like a snake because of all the snake-like features, but definitely not a snake. Whenever Sidisi Brood Tyrant enters the battlefield or attacks, put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard. Whenever 1 or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from your library, put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. Sidisi's trigger is really powerful, making her the queen of a zombie army, but we're going to have to build around it. This means that we're going to need a lot of creatures in our deck, because we want to be able to self-mill ourselves and hit a creature, because every time we hit a creature, we get a zombie. Now, it doesn't matter how many creatures we hit when we mill. Let's say, for example, we traumatize ourselves, flip over 30 cards into the graveyard. They could be all creatures, or only one of them could be a creature. You get the same number of zombies, 1. That means we want to maximize the number of triggers by having small little bits of incidental mill. As we get more and more zombies onto the battlefield, we can embrace the zombie synergies. We know that zombies work really well together. They have great tribal decks, so maybe we can borrow from some of that tribal strategy and make our 2/2 zombie tokens more powerful. And as long as we're self-milling, we might just spread some of the love. Mill everyone a little bit. And as we mill everyone, we might just take advantage of some graveyard value, maybe even some Reanimate or sub-themes. So that's what Sidisi's all about. We're going to embrace her trigger, we're going to play tons of creatures, we might look at zombies, mill, Reanimator, all these great strategies. No wonder why Sidisi is the most popular sultai commander. This just sounds like a whole bunch of fun. Let's get into it. Now, there is a reason I chose to do a deck tech on Sidisi Brood Tyrant now, and not before, and not later. And that's because of a wonderful new card, Path of Discovery. I just want to take a look at this really quickly. 3 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it explores. Explore means that you reveal the top card of your library, and if it's a land, you draw it. Otherwise, put a +1/+1 counter on the creature, then put that card either back on top or into your graveyard. Now, you might be thinking exactly what I'm thinking. Let's go through this. I have Sidisi on the battlefield. Let's say I create a zombie. That is a creature entering the battlefield under my control. That zombie is going to explore, which means I reveal the top card. If it's a land, I basically get to draw. That's great. But even better is that if it's another creature on top of my library, I can throw that in the graveyard, and Sidisi makes me another zombie, and Path of Discovery says, a new creature, let's explore! And then I do it again. This could chain together just a slew of 3/3 zombies until I happen to get unlucky and draw a land. This is amazing. In fact, I love the explore mechanic. Jadelight Ranger's gonna explore like crazy. Emperor's Vanguard, oh, maybe it's gotta deal combat damage, but I'm gonna throw it in anyways. Deadeye Tracker, not too exciting, but I like the ability to maybe exile some cards from my opponent's graveyard, especially if we're gonna be doing a lot of mill. So it's this explore mechanic that really got me into this deck tech. And so I started looking at everything else, and man, Sidisi has got some synergies going on, everything looks great. Let's jump right into her triggers, because this Path of Discovery has gotten me really excited. First up, we have the most powerful, the most synergistic combination in this entire deck, and that's Sidisi and Mesmeric Orb. Now you might be thinking, this is just another mill who can— wait a second. It's because each permanent that's untapped creates its own mill trigger. That means if you untap 10 permanents, you're not just milling 10, you're milling 1 10 times. That means that every single creature that gets turned over off the top of your library and those 10 permanents untapping, that's a zombie. That's really great, because so many other times they'll group the milling together. You know, you mill 7 and it's 1 instance of milling, whereas Mesmeric Orb, it's all separate, which means separate triggers, which means you get a huge zombie army, and then you attack your opponents and untap your zombies and make even more. It's crazy. Next up, we have a Flavor Wind, Taigen Sidisi's Hand. 3 blue black for a 3/4 legendary human wizard, and you skip your draw step. It's not that bad. Okay, at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So that means that you're going to be able to trigger Sidisi over and over and over again because you're literally looking and throwing those away. And it gives you some great card selection. Not to mention an activated ability, which can kind of filter out some of the stuff in your graveyard and take out creatures. I think Tygum's going to go really well in this deck. And as long as we're on a flavor slide, let's include Sidisi Undead Vizier. It's a tutor, but it's on a creature. We really do want things on creatures because those are going to be the things that we are able to get back with our Reanimator, that we're going to be able to make zombies with. We have all the creature synergies here, so I like Sidisi better than Demonic Tutor in this deck. We do include some more tutors, mostly graveyard tutors. Entomb, Intuition, Jared's Orders. All of these will get a zombie, which is great. You think, what? Yeah. Entomb basically searches your library and puts it directly into the graveyard. That triggers Sidisi. Same thing with Gerard's Orders and Intuition, and also Corpse Connoisseur. Corpse Connoisseur is the best one here because it nets you a zombie, it is a zombie, it gets things from the graveyard that you need, and if I mill Corpse Connoisseur, it has Unearth, so I can keep enabling these shenanigans. There's also some creatures that give you incidental mill. Tassiger can mill too, and also come out really early if we have a lot of self-mill enabling. And also Nyxweaver, you get 2 every single turn, and you can cash it in to get the card you need right back out of your graveyard. And there's another card from Rivals of Ixalan inspiring me, and that's World Shaper. 3 and a green for a 3/3 whenever World Shaper attacks, you may put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard. Yes, that's what we want. That's Sidisi all over again. I love it, but there's more when World Shaper dies. Put all lands from your graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. Oh my gosh, this is a splendid reclamation on a dude, but the dude mills you. So it's a creature. I like creatures better than spells. It helps my mill strategy. It's recurable mill, it's on attack, and your opponents don't want to block it because then you get your lands back. World Shaper fits perfectly. So I mentioned mana. I want to mention the 2 favorite mana dorks of this deck. That's Millikin and Deranged Assistant. Both of these can tap for a colorless, but in order to get that colorless, you need to mill a card from your library into your graveyard. I know, it's a no! Many newer players think it's a feel bad if you mill your own cards, you self-mill, but it's really good in almost every situation. I know sometimes there's going to be the feel bad where you mill the card you really need and you're like, oh man, if only I had drawn that. No, you can't think that way. You're gonna mill no matter what. It's good to get cards into your graveyard. You have tools in order to reuse these cards. You want to self-mill. As we're on the topic of mana dorks, I think you should run a bunch of them, because mana is going to be really important in this deck, and you're not going to run Cultivate, Kadama's Reach, Farseek, all those spells, because you want creatures going into your graveyard when you trigger Sidisi. So let's put a lot of those spells on dudes. Birds of Paradise, Shaman of Forgotten Ways. I've included Werebear because when else can you play Werebear? Werebear adds a green, it's just a stupid little mana dork, and then it becomes a 4/4 human bear druid rawr. I've also included Satyr Wayfinder over here because it gives you some self-mill going on, and then lets you hit your land drop. So trust me, there's a lot of room for any type of creature you want in this deck. Feel free to play around with it and have it fit your meta. But one thing that a lot of people are going to be excited about is the synergies that zombies bring to the table. I particularly like Crypt Breaker because it lets you draw cards, and you're going to have a bunch of zombies out on the battlefield. Crypt Breaker also gives you a discard outlet. I know that it won't generate a zombie because it comes from your hand, not from your library, but if we have some Reanimator sub-themes, you might want to get a big fatty out of your hand so that you can reanimate it, and Crypt Breaker really facilitates that. I'm also a huge fan of Custody Lich. I've said it over and over again, you guys should play it, so I'm just going to keep saying it until everyone does play it. This is a zombie that only costs 5 mana. You become the Monarch. You can pick an opponent and they have to sacrifice a creature. So this is a creature kill creature 4/2 that will draw you a card and introduce an interesting mechanic to the game. How is this not in every deck? Custody Lich is amazing. By the way, you kind of like the Monarch. You can deal with creature combat really, really well. There's also Graveborn Muse. It also helps you draw cards. Oh my gosh, we're in the card draw section. At the beginning of your upkeep, draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the number of zombies you control. Now, you could control a lot of zombies, so be very careful, but we're in this to win it. We want to draw tons of cards. I'm actually really excited about a very light zombie sub-theme, because it feels like zombies are really heavy and you don't get to explore other options, but you can still include some cards like the Scarab God, Ixalan Giralf, or Stitcher Giralf. All of these can kind of help facilitate this strategy and be a little bit zombie-y while not going all in and playing every single tribal synergy. Scarab God helps you scry, they lose life, and you could have a lot of zombies on the battlefield. It really helps with this Reanimator sub-theme. Ixalan Giralf, you kind of do need a big critical mass of zombies because you're going to be milling and then you want to be able to cast zombies from the graveyard back again. But Stitcher Giralf does incidental mill for everyone, and so if you have the ability to reanimate your opponent's stuff or reanimate your own things, then Stitcher Giralf can selectively pick what it's going to exile and leave the juicy targets for you to reanimate. Speaking of reanimation, Havenghoul Lich and Lord of the Undead can really rebuy a lot of these great cards that end up in your graveyard. As you can see, incidental mill is very important in this deck. We want to get things in our graveyard, have a lot of milling synergies, and this Mesmeric Orb does give us this incidental mill. But it can actually just mill people out like crazy. Like, this is actually quite a dangerous card. I mean, if we're going to have a little bit of self-mill in this, we could lean into that strategy and go with like a mill sub-theme. We can play Dreamborn Muse, 2 blue for a 2/2 spirit, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of cards in his or her hand. So you mill the number of cards you have in your hand. We're fine with that. We have ways to play with our graveyard, we have all sorts of synergies. Our opponents, well, they just might get milled out. Going deeper, we have Altar of Dementia and Consuming Aberration. Now, Altar of Dementia, you might think, oh, this can facilitate our own zombie creation. Not really. If you sacrifice a zombie to mill to and then you're like, yay, I get a zombie, you are milling yourself kind of for free, but it doesn't work that well. What could work really well is you have an army of zombies that can't get through, and then suddenly you sacrifice all of them and mill your opponent for 20. That's pretty okay. It's also really valuable to have an instant speed sacrifice outlet that doesn't require mana, just boom, kill your thing. Because you really don't want your opponents stealing your stuff, and also you might be reanimating some of their creatures, so you might want to be able to sacrifice them in response to a Homeward Path activation or something like that. Consuming Aberration just gets huge. And so if you have incidental mill, you can just have a horror that takes over the game. It's really powerful. And again, we can jump into this with another legendary creature, Phoenix, God of Deception. This deck could be running a lot of different legendary creatures that have really cool effects in this color combination, giving it a feeling that you're playing with a lot of really big, powerful commanders all in one single synergistic deck. Let's talk about the value we get when we chuck something into the graveyard. I first think of cards like Wonder and Genesis. Wonder gives your creatures flying as long as you control an island. Genesis allows you to get creatures from your graveyard back to your hand. Both of these are going to be great. I especially like Wonder at instant speed. If you have Entomb, you can Entomb your Wonder and then suddenly, boom, all your zombies have flying, and that's a way to take someone out of the game. I also like Filth a little bit less than Wonder. If you're running Urborg, you can make sure everyone has swamps, and then suddenly your creatures are just as unblockable. Genesis is great value. In fact, this deck might want Palace Siege. You mill a bunch of creatures, then every single turn you draw a creature from your graveyard, your best creature. That could be great. We do want to be careful. I think Palace Siege is great, and I kind of want it in this deck, but whenever you're adding a card that isn't a creature, you have to think very carefully and say, do I really need this card? Because what it does is it takes away from your overall strategy with Sidisi. That's why I want to mention these next two cards with a grain of salt, Increasing Ambition and Forbidden Alchemy. They're great cards. They have flashback, so if you accidentally mill them, they still have value from your graveyard, and that's what we're talking about, graveyard value, but they're spells. They're not creatures, so maybe we can have some of these same abilities on a creature and we might like them a little bit more. Let's talk about some more things that you can get back from your graveyard, like Jared Golgari Lichlord, another legendary creature that could go in this deck. Golgari Grave Troll, a classic. Everyone loves Golgari Grave Troll, and you can get him back from your graveyard if you dredge. You like to dredge. Now, some people might be thinking, let's go a little bit heavier into dredge, but a lot of times dredging creatures are a little bit underwhelming in Commander. You maybe have a little bit of dredge here, a little bit of dredge there, and I think you'll be happy. I don't think you need to go over the top with dredging. And of course, there's World Breaker. Sacrifice land, return World Breaker from your graveyard to your hand. And there are other cards that will return themselves from your graveyard to the battlefield. But I think you want high impact cards. You don't necessarily want Grave Crawlers and Bloodghasts coming back. Maybe if you have like a little bit of a sacrifice strategy, but in this deck, we really want to kind of go bigger than our opponents, go wider with Sidisi. Now, if you want to exclude a card like World Breaker and bring the curve down to include some of those more aggressive cards, maybe I'd like to suggest a card like Night Howler. This can get really big really quickly if you're milling the entire table and be a much more aggressive card. Fair warning, I think it'll be difficult to make this an aggressive deck, but it could be really fun to just stomp your opponents with zombies and huge Night Howlers. The next category is Reanimation, and I feel like the first card really meshes perfectly with this entire strategy, and that's Liliana, Death's Majesty. 3 black for a 5 loyalty planeswalker, and the +1 fits so well. Create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. This is creating zombies. It's incidental mill. This is perfect. And the -3 is that reanimator that we really wanted. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield that creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. Yes, this is an expensive reanimation spell, but I really think that the +1 and bringing Liliana up to 6 loyalty and generating some zombies here and there, and let's not forget about all the value that comes from just having cards in our graveyard. But now remember, if we can have reanimation on a creature, we would prefer it, so Phyrexian Delver and Sepulchral Primordial are going to be our default ways of taking advantage of cards that we've milled into our graveyards and our opponents. I know Reanimate is efficient and great, but I'm going to prefer the Phyrexian Delver over it. The same thing goes for Body Double. Cloning a creature card in a graveyard is going to be really strong. And Chainer Dementia Master. I think we've been talking about how many legends can go in this deck, and why not throw in Chainer? I think you're going to have a fun time playing around with so many different cards. I also like Dread Return for this category. Remember how I mentioned Flashback before? Well, Dread Return has Flashback. You can just sacrifice a few of the zombies that you've generated from Sidisi and then get back a real threat from the graveyard. And then finally, we can have over-the-top finishers like Rise of the Dark Realms and Living Death. These 2 spells are kind of at odds with one another, actually. If we're milling everyone, Rise of the Dark Realms is going to be great because we get all of what we've milled them for. Living Death, on the other hand, will let them get back so many of their big creatures. Interesting. I think this is why we need to make sure to include some graveyard hate, even though we're a graveyard deck, and this is what a lot of people leave out of the strategy. I think that Bojuka is a perfect example. Just play Bojuka, be able to wipe out your opponent, and even though you're messing with the graveyard, you don't want to facilitate their strategy. Just be careful, because there are a lot of decks out there that also use their graveyard as a resource, so you don't want to be feeding your opponent while you just want to make zombies. Alright, that has been my breakdown for Sidisi Brood Tyrant. I have really liked this deck and liked this card a lot. I really like the zombie synergies. I like the restriction of playing with creatures instead of creatures and spells in a balance. I think that's going to be really fun, especially with all the legendary creatures that I've seen and sort of the zombie mill sub-themes. And I really feel like there's a lot of directions you can take this deck. It's pulling in so many different ways. You can start off with a very basic version and then start adding in more zombies or adding in more mill or really ramping up the creatures so that your Reanimator package is really robust. That's Sidisi. I really like this deck and I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd like to thank my patrons. Thank you very much, everyone. You can find me on patreon.com/jumbocommander. Heck, you can find me all over the internet. Twitter, email, you can even find me in the comment section down below. I'll see you guys next time for even more Commander content.